Hello, book burners, and welcome to another episode of Books Are Burning. I'm your host, Mark Will, in Taipei, and I'm joined once again by my special guest, GJ Villa. How are you
Hello, hello.
today? Good to see you again. We will continue our discussion today of Benjamín Labatut's When We Cease to Understand the World. And today we will focus on section 2 of this fascinating novel. And section 2 is called Schwarzschild's Singularity. And I would like to give a brief introduction to Karl Schwarzschild and his theory of the singularity. So I may have mentioned in episode 1 that with all of the different historical personages, most of them scientists, some of them military folk, um, I would like to have a kind of mind map with portraits of all of these characters and little spider web lines showing all the connections among them. A kind of graphic organizer would really help me make sense of the narrative. I didn't create such a mind map or graphic organizer for part one, but today I have printed out from Wikipedia a portrait of our hero, Mr. Karl Schwarzschild. Those of you listening can't see this, but you can go to Wikipedia and you'll see the portrait of this gentleman who is our focus. And his portrait reminds me of H.L. Mencken's quote that the learned are seldom pretty fellows.
It's
So,
quite a mustache.
yeah, interesting face. But Karl Schwarzschild, or I guess the anglicized version would be Schwarzschild, but I'm using the German pronunciation. Schwarzschild, Black Shield, Karl Schwarzschild. He is described by Labatut as astronomer, physicist, mathematician, and lieutenant in the German army, and his military service is relevant to the narrative, as I'm sure we will mention later. But in Labatut's narrative and in reality, Schwarzschild sends Einstein, who needs no introduction, uh, the first exact solution to the equations of general relativity. And this solution perfectly described the manner in which the mass of a star deforms the space and time surrounding it. Uh, and according to the equation that Schwarzschild came up with, uh, space time would not simply bend, it would tear apart given a certain set of circumstances which are difficult for the reader to imagine, or at least this reader. And this would this rending of space and time would create an inescapable abyss permanently cut off from the rest of the universe. And this is what we call the singularity, Schwarzschild's singularity. In layman's terms, uh, this is not made explicit by the narrative, but basically what we're talking about here is a black hole. Am I right?
Yes, that is right. Yeah, I would also add that uh, for our listeners who may not have read this, Schwarzschild sends the Einstein the first exact solution to the equations of general relativity while serving as a lieutenant in World War One. So we have the context of the First Great War, which was alluded to, was certainly was covered in the previous section, which we discussed. Right, we pick up
As
there
well as
again.
World
There's
War II, right?
the two world wars covered in the first section, right? With these two convulsive moments in European history, certainly. And we begin that way with part two, right? We're in the middle of World War One, and here's this brilliant genius who sends another brilliant genius the solutions to uh, the equations of general relativity. So that's how we're launched into part two of this book, which is, as we talked about last time, about strange, perplexing ideas that defy comprehension. And certainly black holes, as you just described them, fits the bill.
Very difficult to conceive. I mean, maybe I'm just too stupid to imagine or understand what's going on, but very difficult to conceive. Uh, yeah, you say he's a genius, and for some reason, this genius thought it would be a good idea to serve in the military, in the German military. How could someone so intelligent otherwise be so naively deluded, right? To think that serving his country, as by the way, a Jewish person, right? I mean, uh, at the time of World War I, conditions in Germany weren't quite as bad as they would soon get, but you would think or hope that he would have the foresight to understand that his talents might not be best made use of by the German military machine.
That's true, but I think that naivete is a larger cultural naivete, one that is completely, of course, shattered by the horrors unleashed by World War One. And in fact, relatively early on in this section, we get a portrait of the protagonist's idealism. We're told that he was convinced that mathematics, physics, and astronomy constituted a single body of knowledge, and believed, and here's the interesting part, that Germany was capable of exercising a civilizing force comparable to that of ancient Greece. So, yes, that sounds absolutely naive for us when we consider the horrors that will come in World War One, and certainly the horrors of World War Two. It's a little bit like Monday morning quarterbacking, though, right? How could he not have seen that? Where I think that sentence in the history of Europe at the turn of the century, and certainly Germany, right? This notion that Germany was the apex of civilization, right? Certainly Europe in general, Germany in particular, right? That was certainly shared, I think, by many people, including Schwarzschild.
Mm.
So well, I think the book is certainly is showcasing these moments of blindness, of human blindness, right? And genius itself, right? This notion of unification, unifying these different sciences, they form a single body of knowledge. I'm in the most advanced civilization on Earth, right? Germany really hadn't been a nation state that long, right? Not until the end of the 19th century, right? So there was certainly, this is I think, a critique of the kind of idealism that nationalism, a dangerous idealism that extreme forms of nationalism can foster.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of a modern equivalent. I mean, it would be like the foolish naivety of a person who thinks that in the 21st century, in the year 2023, the American empire is somehow a force for good in the world. I mean, that's the modern equivalent I would think of. And I guess there are examples of those who learned the lesson too late, like Edward Snowden. Maybe he thought he was doing God's work after 9/11, and then he learned what was really going on, and he had a change of heart.
Right. Well, certainly, I mean, politically in the United States, it's pretty much, at least on a national level, you're politically dead if you don't adhere implicitly, if not explicitly, to the tired, deluded notion of American exceptionalism, right?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, was there at that time, I mean, were there people in Germany who knew what certain people who are not in the mainstream today know about the American empire? I mean, surely there were, right? There were people like Rosa Luxemburg and uh, other uh, folk who were part of resistance movements and were critical of German imperialism in the same way that there are critics of American empire today. But maybe a Schwarzschild would not have been able to do what he did in the sciences had he not bought into this ideology, because things like funding are dependent upon a certain ideological conformity.
Yeah, I certainly think
That
that there's a confluence with him. I think in terms of his scientific idealism, right, and the way that that
mm,
bleeds over into his political idealism, which was shared by many, certainly.
and that you know perhaps under the influence of his illness, which we can get into in a moment, but that idealism is completely shattered, at least in the fictionalized portrait that Labatut gives us, right? Not only the political idealism, but a kind of spiritual idealism that turns into the darkest, literally the darkest, since we're talking about black holes, the darkest kind of pessimism, right? Like
Right,
the illness in his body is kind of a microcosm for Germany, Europe, and in a larger sense, the world, even the entire universe.
right.
So, why don't you tell us about that illness, which is described by Labatut as a shadow? That shadow invaded his body. I mean, I should first back up and say, the shadow of the singularity that he conceived, this notion of the black hole. This is something that is described as unthinkable,
Right,
inconceivable, a
right.
void without form or dimension, a shadow I can't see, but one that I can feel with the entirety of my soul. It's also called a rupture, a blind spot, fundamentally unknowable, a place where physics no longer had any meaning. And then that shadow invades his body. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, he is plagued by, where is it? What is the actual affliction that he's plagued by? It essentially his body breaks out into blisters and pustules. He's unable to eat food anymore because there's blisters down his throat and so on, right? So he's essentially incapacitated bodily. And one of the things that Labatut is doing, and this is where, as we talked about last time, he's kind of taking elements of history and merging them into an interesting fiction. Labatut is the one who makes up, quote unquote, right? Who fictionalizes um, the way in which the main character, our historical figure, right, is increasingly losing his idealism. Um, his notion of black holes is undermining his conception of the universe as a stable place. How could this exist, as he says, this form without void, etc. Um, and then his body is beginning to corrode, right? And that's causing him physical, but more importantly, psychological malaise. But the longer the war goes on, right, he begins to lose his naive idealism in Germany's humanizing effect, right? So we have the political, the personal, and the physical, right, and the scientific. All of these three strands are coming together in this character's mind and causing him to sink into a kind of despair, not only about his own body, which is corroding, of course, horrible enough, not only about the radical nature of his scientific breakthrough. How could this be? How does the universe make sense this way? But most importantly, I think about the deteriorating effects of the war and how that portends for him a kind of darkness, right? A spiritual darkness that's going to engulf all of Europe. And certainly we can't help thinking about World War I and World War II, given that Chapter 1 has already made affinities between those two seismic events, right? So this is where the book gets really interesting to me, right? That he imagines this historical figure and imagines that he must, at least in this rendering of him, right? He's a character plagued by these forms of darkness and seeing the parallels among them, right? And I think that becomes explicit. Let's see, at one point, Labatut tells us that he sends a letter to a colleague, right, from university. It says, which included a draft of his Singularity, a description of the blisters that had begun to appear on his skin, and a long digression on the insidious effects the war might have on Germany's soul, a country Schwarzschild continued to love, but that he saw reeling on the edge of an abyss. We have reached the highest point of civilization, quote unquote, right? All that is left for us is to decay and fall. So
that's the second instance of the word abyss.
Indeed. And I like
that's
the way
mentioned at least twice.
I think Labatut's notion of Germany, the insidious effects that war might have on Germany's soul, this is the notion that countries have their own souls, right? Their own people, etc. This certainly springs out of 19th century romanticism, thinking, right?
Yeah.
The Volk, the soul of the people, the idea that Germany somehow has an essence. And we know the dangers that those notions, right? The notions of blood and soil, contain, right? So there it is, that his spiritual and political naivete, right, is starting to crumble as the war goes on. And he becomes not just a scientist in Labatut's imagining, but a kind of clairvoyant, right? Someone who can sort of foresee the future. And I think he does this throughout the book, right? All of these scientific figures, he imagines them as being possessed of the ability to sense darkly, future disaster.
Well, and also, as I think I mentioned in the last episode, one of the themes of the book to me is that the scientist is a kind of writer or author. And there's a line, surely fictional, but during his military service, Schwarzschild carried his notebook beneath his uniform close to his chest. So even in the midst of battle, he's writing as authors do under the most adverse circumstances. They're trying to record their testimony or whatever it is they want to bequeath to their contemporaries and the future. But the word abyss, I want to come back to that. It reminds me of the quote from Nietzsche, who said, when you look into the abyss also looks into you. So this fixation on black holes and all these oddities of space-time eventually were how can we say it? They had that effect on the internal psychology of the person viewing those events, in the universe. Like
right.
Inner space and outer space are intimately connected. When you look into the abyss also looks into you.
Right.
And by the way, the disease that we're talking about is called pemphigus. It is a disease in which the body fails to recognize its own cells and attacks them violently. So in his case, it manifested as blisters all over. It started, according to the Labatut version, started on the corner of his mouth or something, and then spread throughout his body. And Labatut makes a point of noting that Ashkenazi Jews show a particular sensitivity to this disease. So again, it highlights his Jewishness in German society. And there's another detail about that Jewishness too. Do you remember he at one of the universities he refuses to undergo baptism uh, because he doesn't want to renounce his Judaism? Do you remember this? Like
Yeah.
there's a position that he's offered. I think they still give it to him, but traditionally people had to be baptized because I don't know, it was a religious Christian
Right.
institution, but he's like, "No, I'm good. I'm going to retain my Judaism."
Right.
But another description of it is acute necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis. That's how the pemphigus is described. Gingivitis, I thought, was a gum disease, so maybe it starts there and then spread. That's pretty horrific form of gum disease that spreads throughout the body. It says his body was transformed, as it were, into a miniature model of war-torn Europe. So there's
Yeah.
that individual as microcosm of something much larger.
Right. Yeah. And his singularity is, of course, the big controlling metaphor for this section, and in many ways for the book. Right. A metaphor for the horror of the unknown, right? For the fall of civilization, for the end of the Enlightenment, um, the end of the naive notion that science can cure us of all our ills, right? All of those things are falling here, just as his body is corroding away.
Some of the backstory is really interesting too, like the development of him from really from childhood, at least as Labatut imagines him. And we can talk about how uh, the book is becoming progressively more fictionalized, but there's probably factual basis for this. I mean, as a youth, he was, in Labatut's reckoning, fascinated with the rings of Saturn. And there again, we have that connection with the great German author Sebald, who wrote a book called The Rings of
Right.
Saturn. And I was reminded of the scientific fact that the actual rings of Saturn. This is what I remember when I read The Rings of Saturn. That's when that book really I don't know. It took me like to another level when I made this connection. The actual rings of Saturn are made of ice and like debris. It's like broken asteroids, basically interstellar trash that's like frozen. That's what the rings are. The rings of
Right.
Saturn are like that. And so I realized that's what Sebald and, I would say Labatut as well, are doing with their fiction. They're taking all of these disparate sources, junk as it were, and then
Mm.
putting it together, creating something beautiful. We described it as a collage. Uh, what else do we say? It
We said
was like
the artist is a kind of weaver, right? Weaving
weaving,
together these
but
strands.
but think of it as like those rings of Saturn. You see them at a distance, and it's aesthetically beautiful, right? But on closer inspection, it's just a bunch of disparate sources. It's just a bunch of trash that happen to be arranged. It's like order is brought to chaos, which is what the author does, right? Like he or she um creates order out of chaos from a variety of sources.
Right. That's certainly what our the pieces, the fragments woven together, right? That's certainly what's happening here. And as we continue with this chapter is relatively short, one of the shorter ones, maybe 20, little over 20 pages. He tells us this fascinating story of this historical figure. Uh, and we talked last time also about the way in which Labatut, the weaver, right, the collagist, is an epiphany junkie. So that when
Mm-hmm.
he's ordering these different fragments into a cohesion, right? Something beautiful, aesthetically shaped, right? He's leading everything towards epiphany. And in the first chapter, all of the pieces other than this final paragraph, as we discussed, right, are historical, right, which makes it ingenious, right? So in that sense, he's just weaving together all of these historical pieces, but not making anything up, right? But in the weaving process, the collage-like arrangement, it becomes something made by the artist, right? In this section, it's a little bit different, right? Yes, it's full of historical accuracies. Obviously, the protagonist was a historical figure. He did solve provide exact solutions to the equations of relativity. He did die in warfare of that blistering disease and so on. But the great moment of fictionalizing comes when he has his character come to these epiphanies himself. So Labatut, the epiphany junkie, likes to takes this character, the historical figure, and makes him become seized by a very unsettling epiphany, right? And so when we look at the culmination here, we have Labatut imagining Schwarzschild, writing a letter to a colleague where he's trembling on the abyss, essentially, right? And we hear that if matter were prone to birthing monsters of this kind, the singularity, Schwarzschild asked with a trembling voice, were there correlations with the human psyche? Could a sufficient concentration of human will, millions of people exploited for a single end with their minds compressed into the same psychic space, unleash something comparable to the singularity? Schwarzschild was convinced that such a thing was not only possible, but was actually taking place in the fatherland. And then later, we have the character babbling about, quote unquote, a black sun dawning over the horizon, capable of engulfing the entire world. And he lamented that there was nothing we could do about it because the singularity sent forth no warnings. The point of no return, the limit past which one fell prey to its unforgiving pull, had no sign or demarcation. Whoever crossed it was beyond hope. Their destiny was set as all possible trajectories led irrevocably to the singularity, right? And then he says, and if such was the nature of that threshold, how would we know if we had already crossed it? So that's the great moment, I think, the culmination of, right, this chapter, this epiphany that seizes the protagonist, right? Which is really Labatut, the epiphany junkie's epiphany, right?
Well, yes,
He imagines his character having this epiphany, and it's a horrific one, right? And again, we have the notion of the scientist as kind of clairvoyant, right? Because what he's talking about is not just World War I, but World War II. This point of no return is if you have enough people in a country, millions of people in the same psychic space, at what point does humanity cross over into the monster, right? You wouldn't know it when it would happen, right? So that to me is what's fascinating here. There's a little bit more fictionalizing than we see, right? And Labatut mentions that this is a book in which, and I love the way he phrased this in one of the interviews, the fiction blooms chapter by chapter and becomes exponentially greater.
Yeah, well, that scene and the scene you described. There is a letter he sends someone, but then there's also this imagined scene with it's in the hospital as he's dying, and he's talking to another scientist named Richard Courant, or maybe it's Richard Courant.
That was actually the scene I was talking about. So if I said letter,
Yeah,
my mistake. Yeah, this is
yeah,
the scene he imagines this scene between him and Courant.
well, maybe they actually met. I don't know if that's historically accurate or not, but I doubt there was such a precise transcript of their conversation. Maybe Courant reported something about, having had a final interview or discussion with him, but that's clearly one of the examples of the fictionalizing. And another one, I love this. He's talking about the time, this is earlier when we're getting some of the backstory on Schwarzschild. He looked too long at a total eclipse, right? Like
Right.
you're not supposed to stare at it for too long, but he couldn't help himself. And then Labatut includes this beautiful line. You know, he's imagining that Schwarzschild said it himself. Maybe there's some record of it, but anyway, it says he, like Odin, had sacrificed one eye to be able to see further with the other, because that one eye suffered permanent damage. You know,
Right.
he never recovered from that. So and again, here you have him buying into this Germanic mythos, right? Like
Right.
the same guy that believes in the spiritual and cultural mission of Germany is also like alluding to Wagnerian opera and Germanic
Nordic
myth,
myth. Yeah.
Nordic
Right.
myth, right? So that was a wonderful detail, and also like his awkwardness around women. I mean, we saw his picture. I can well imagine him being awkward around women, but there's like a description of him accidentally touching his wife's breast as he's adjusting the telescope for her. Did that happen? Maybe, maybe not, but it's a nice detail, you know.
Right.
You can well it definitely seems to be in character from what little I know of him. Um, let's see. Yet last episode, we talked about the genre of this work, and I raised the possibility that in a way we can characterize this book as sci-fi. I mean, it's not science fiction in the sense that you know, Philip K. Dick is, or Ursula Le Guin, right? Or I don't know, who's your favorite sci-fi author? Maybe those
I
two
mean,
are your favorite, right?
yeah, I'm not a huge sci-fi fan, but I've read some. Certainly, I've read books by both of those authors.
Yeah. Well, J.G. Ballard, right?
Yeah, yeah. Speculative fiction, maybe you'd call him more than sci-fi, but sure.
Yeah. Um, Burroughs to some degree, but look, it's fiction about science, and then the things that are discussed seem like science fiction. This singularity, even though it is scientific, it has been proven allegedly, even if I can't follow it or understand it. Doesn't it read like sci fi? Listen to this: space flowed like time, time stretched out like space. And then there's this description of someone, uh, if you could survive like the gravitational pull of the singularity, you would see two superimposed images. In one, you would perceive the entire future evolution of the universe at an inconceivable pace. In the other, the past frozen in a single instant. I mean, that's a total mindfuck, isn't it? That's like something out of sci-fi, even though it is scientific.
Sure. The weirdness of science, and the weirdness of these abstruse ideas that the layman, i.e., us, however educated we may be, can't really fully comprehend or bend our minds around. Um, and for that matter, Schwarzschild himself, who's so, I like the way that he has the scientist so flabbergasted by his own discovery. It's as if he can't fully understand it. I put that in quotations. He has the mathematical equations for it, right? And we get
Yeah.
this later when we get to um, a subsequent chapter, right? When we cease to understand the world, it's called, of right, about quantum physics. That's certainly the same case, right? These disorienting uh, and somehow valid theories, right? Another description, to your point, of the weirdness of these discoveries. We hear that anticipating Einstein, Schwarzschild had considered the hypothesis that the geometry of the universe was less like a three-dimensional box than something that could be twisted and deformed, right?
Yes.
So all of these weird ideas that come straight out of the mind, that seem to come out of the mind of maybe a science fiction writer, are actually inspired by science itself.
And there's a mystical strain to that, like as that description continues. it mentions a semi-spherical universe yielding a world that would turn in on itself like an Ouroboros. That's the snake
Right.
that
Right.
eats its
Right.
own tail. It's kind of a symbol of infinity, and it's also, you know, uh, an alchemical symbol. And again, in this section, that connection between science and alchemy, the hearkening back to the days before chemistry and alchemy were firmly, you know, distinguished. Uh,
Right.
like it says in Labatut's imagining, Schwarzschild aspired to the type of knowledge the alchemists had pursued. So
Right.
again, we see science, which we in the modern world think of naively, I would say, as infallible, right? Follow the science. Well, science certainly takes us in many different directions. And I wanted to mention last time when we were talking about all the adverse side effects of science in the Prussian blue section. This is a warning that other so-called sci-fi authors like Vonnegut mentioned. He was well aware of the dangers of science and technology. He, just consider Slaughterhouse-Five. He's like, science did this shit. This would
Right.
not have been possible without science. So science is not our savior necessarily, even though we have people like, the great Bertrand Russell, whom I admire in so many other ways, rather naively assuming that science is the answer to all our problems. Science will fix everything, even when there's like something that is ostensibly good, like we talked about Hopper's uh, discovery of nitrogen based fertilizer, right? Oh, that's good because it can feed the world. But at the same time, it creates the possibility that vegetation will overrun the earth and thus humanity.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Overpopulation, giving more fresh bodies for warfare, um, unintended consequences of so-called progress. Right. Um, yeah. Going back to the point, and we'll certainly discuss this, I think, in more detail next time when we get to the next section, the heart of the heart, which is about the mathematician Alexander Grothendieck. Right. But in some of the interviews that I watched with Labatut, he talked about that his interest in mathematics, at least complex mathematics, and certainly Schwarzschild's equations, right? Who can understand them? If you lay them out before either of the two of us, for instance, we wouldn't know even how to read those equations, right?
Definitely
But
not.
when he's talking about advanced mathematics, Labatut says that he's interested in mathematics precisely because of the mysticism, the way in which that kind of deep abstract thinking ultimately leads to a kind of mysticism. Um, and, we'll look at Grothendieck, his story, right? He ends up almost like a mad monk, if you will, right? More to come on that later, right? But
Yeah.
that next section that we'll discuss next time really delves into um, complete mathematical abstraction, right?
Hmm.
In tune with the way in which this book is looking at strange ideas that defy comprehension. If we've looked at black holes here, right, we're going to look into the deepest recesses of mathematical abstractions in the next section.
Yeah. Well, I've just got two more questions for you, and then if
Sure.
you have anything, we can get to that, and then we'll wrap it up. Um, First, what do you think about the depiction of Einstein in this book in general and in this section in particular?
Oh, well, that's certainly one. When we get to the quantum physics section, right? Uh, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is his resistance to uh, Heisenberg's ideas, right? And the way that he's repelled by the notion that there's a certain unknowability.
And Schwarzschild's,
And
right?
Schwarzschild as well, right? Right. We get a
Yeah.
hint of that, but certainly not to the later section where if we think about characters, right, historical figures at characters, he becomes a much more pronounced character later on. But here, yes, we get he's the one who hatches these equations, right? Here's someone who gives the first exact solutions, and so we get that notion introduced that Einstein, who believed in harmony and knowability ultimately, and so on, right, is foraging into these territories that will ultimately lead even him into a kind of crisis, right? Metaphysical and
Well,
psychological crisis.
what I find interesting is that, in the popular imagination, if we think about 20th century scientists, what does the popular mind, or whom does the popular mind think of? Of course, Einstein. I mean, it's even like encoded in our language. Yeah, he's a real Einstein. That's what, that's the term we use for a genius or a person who's highly intelligent, right? An
Right.
Einstein. But
Sure.
I think that notion is undercut throughout the book. And even in this chapter, it's talking about Einstein's resistance to Schwarzschild's ideas. And then there's like a standalone paragraph, which is just one sentence saying, but the calculations of the greatest mind of the 20th century were wrong.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like maybe Einstein is not such a fucking Einstein after all. I
Well,
think that is I think he's suggesting that early in this second section of the book, and then we get more of that later. I mean, as I remember, we'll talk about it more when we get to that section. Einstein seems like a petulant child, like insisting, no, God does not play dice with the universe. Stop saying that.
right.
There's that kind of uh, almost childishness, but we'll
Sure.
we'll get into that later. But I think he's trying to say something about uh, maybe the popular uh, idolization of Einstein. I mean, look at all the. I didn't even know. Everyone knows Einstein. How many of these other scientists did you know, like before you read this? Okay,
Sure.
sure, you've heard of Heisenberg, if for no other reason than
Schrodinger.
you watch
Yeah.
Breaking Bad. You've heard of Oppenheimer because of his association with the bomb, right? But how many of the others?
Right. Bohr, Schrodinger, right? But Grothendieck, I didn't really know much about that mathematician, the subject of the next one. Schwarzschild, not at all. Of course, I didn't really care too much for physics when I was younger. So, yeah, one of the things that Labatut talks about as well in some of those interviews that I found absolutely fascinating, he among other things, being an epiphany junkie, interested in strange ideas that defy comprehension. He also says he's interested in madness and delirium, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that plays out in this book is that these great minds who are traversing these highly abstract realms of thought, right, descend into either metaphysical and existential despair, the way he has Schwarzschild do, right? Or they go to the brink of sanity and cross over into madness, and that becomes more pronounced in the next couple of sections, I think, right? And he talks about the way in
And
which
mysticism. And
and mysticism,
mysticism.
right, and the border between sort of holy insight and madness may be paper thin, right? Um, but he talks about the way in which these highly abstract ideas, and he calls them radioactive ideas, he says that they can change who you are and how you think. So that's something else that I think he's doing. He's looking at the scientist, the mathematician, these great minds as kind of mental explorers launching out into the unknown, and the consequences of those voyagings on their psyches. And the consequences are not good, right? So in that
Mm-hmm.
sense, he's sort of undermining uh, uh, facile, cliched notions of, say, the scientist, as you were talking about, right? Uh, and he's exploring the kind
Well,
of dark.
I would point out that yes, for sure. But I was just going to add that even though these scientific figures are not well known to idiots like us, or I won't include you in it necessarily, but
I'm happy to be
idiots
one of the
like, oh,
one of the
okay,
happy
well,
idiots. Sure, sure.
idiots
No,
like
no
both
offense.
of us, and myself for sure. They are known to those who follow scientific achievements of the 20th century. For example, there's this fascinating interview with Cormac McCarthy at the Santa Fe Institute, which is where he has like some kind of fellowship there where he writes his brilliant novels, but it's a kind of a retreat center for scientists, right? And so he likes being there because he can talk to physicists and evolutionary biologists and so on. And so in one of these interviews from the Santa Fe Institute, Cormac McCarthy is talking about literally every character in this book.
Oh,
Like
hmm.
I was astonished because I saw the interview after reading this book, and it's like, oh, he's mentioning Grothendieck, he's mentioning Schrodinger, he's mentioning, I think he mentions Schwarzschild too, Bohr for sure, Heisenberg, uh, and actually he's written an essay about the Ouroboros, which appeared in a dream to the science. I think his name is Kekula. He's the one who uh, correctly like visualized or illustrated the um, what is it, benzene or something, and it came to him in a vision, it came to him in a dream. So again, there's this connection between mysticism and science, and
Right.
McCarthy is big on the idea of the unconscious doing a lot of the work. He calls it the night shift, right? Like
Hmm.
that's when your unconscious or subconscious mind works on the problems of the day during
Right.
sleep, and often scientific discoveries are uh you know or scientific problems are solved in dreams, and you wake up and there's the answer. And he talks about how one scientist dreamed of having dinner with this other scientist. It was just in the dream, and they had a conversation. He woke up, he solved the problem, he wrote the paper that explained what was going on, and he gave credit to the scientist that he conversed with in his dream.
Right. Yeah. Didn't I might be misremembering, but didn't one of the discoverers of DNA, either Watson or Crick, I don't remember what, didn't this might be listener, you look this up. I might be completely wrong. Uh, wasn't that inspired by was it LSD or psilocybin or something like that? That sort of helped uh, engender the breakthrough in terms of the conceptualization of what DNA was. Anyway,
That
dear
might
reader, I
be
may be
right.
completely wrong, but I feel like I remember reading that somewhere, right? So
Well,
the idea that these things happen. I mean, Labatut also talks about how mining the unconscious is central to the creative process. So that very notion that you're talking about, that McCarthy talked, I mean, I think that's central to Labatut and the way he thinks about creativity.
yeah. Well, I mean, he already talked about the influence of drugs in the first section, at least the influence of amphetamines on the German military. So
Right,
we'll
right.
see if anything else develops in the following sections. One last thing, we're up on 50 minutes here, so Schwarzschild's singularity, as we know, is referring to uh, black holes. It's a physical phenomenon, but this term, the singularity, has now been applied to what's called the technological singularity.
Right,
Uh,
right, right.
and this is the point at which technology uh, expands to such a degree that we lose complete control of it. We sort of enter a kind of civilizational black hole, I guess. And I fear that this may be upon us with the development of AI. You know, the new Chat GPT that is like getting smarter and smarter all along. How much longer before artificial intelligence and artificial superintelligence overtakes us? Like renders us useless. Like we're no longer employable because fucking robots are teaching our classes and writing our books and composing our music and so on. Is
Right.
that is my fear irrational, or are we
No, I don't think
all
so at all. I mean, I think that I think what you're talking about is technological utopianism, right? And
or dystopianism?
sure, exactly. I think that this book is a warning about any kind of utopian thinking leads pretty much to dystopia, right? Dystopian ends. So we should always approach those with humility, and maybe that's something that the humanities, the much maligned humanities, right? Um, which is always about how wisdom and knowledge can be gleaned from any sort of historical moment, right? You can go back to Plato, you can go back to Confucius, you can go back and still think of ways to read those texts and make them applicable, right? All that's predicated on the notion that the humans as political animals, as social animals, right, are always evolving in strange and in unforeseeable ways. I think that's and it makes room for human complexity, human nuance, human ambiguity, the things that make us human. All that's in I think in contrast to or stands in opposition to technological utopianism, right, which begins with the notion that right our scientific creations can somehow make the world a not just a better place, but perhaps
A
a place
perfect
of
place.
utopia. Right, right,
Yeah.
right. So
Well, have
those are
you?
dangers we need to be aware of and always approach. I mean, anytime you talk, you hear people talking about um, this singularity, technological singularity. With you can hear that messianic gleam in their voices, right? That itself should give us pause, right? The tone, the adulating tone, right? The infatuation with which they deliver these utopic pronouncements.
Well, there are a lot of people sounding the alarms as well. You know,
Sure.
uh, but I'll just close with this. Our mutual friend Maria C recommended a fantastic novel. It's a sci-fi novel uh, called TikTok. Nothing to do with the Chinese fucking social app, but this is a novel from I think the '80s by John Sladek or Sladek. I read it last year. Fantastically hilarious, brilliant, satirical dystopian novel. It's about a killer robot named TikTok, right? Like he's programmed by humans to obey certain laws, like I think it's a satire on Asimov, whom I've not read, but there are rules for artificial intelligence and robots that, according to Asimov, uh, robots must be programmed to follow, to ensure the safety of humans. But this robot TikTok is like a sociopathic robot. He learns how to violate all of Asimov's laws, and
All right.
he becomes like a psychopathic murderer and a liar and a thief and like a ruthless capitalist. Um, it's hilarious. I recommend it highly, and
Well, nobody read.
it's just a
Yeah.
warning of the dangers of these overly optimistic notions of
Right.
progress and uh, the technological singularity. And oh, it's going to give us so much more time. Well, no, you're going to be out of a job, and maybe much worse.
Well, yeah. That's that, and that's I think where fiction writers, sci-fi writers, speculative fiction writers dystopian thinkers, whatever you want to call them, right? They come, they're so valuable for us, right? They use the imagination, right, to assess current trends, right, and imagine the future, right? Just maybe a few years in the future, maybe 50 years in the future. What happens if we continue at this pace, right? Nobody talks about the great utopian novels, right? They're great dystopian novels, right? Precisely because they have something to say to us, right? Um, uh, there wouldn't even point in a utopian novel, right? What would be the point of that, right? Novels predicated on narrative is predicated on some kind of conflict, levels of ambiguity, right? To create drama and so on, right? But anyway, yeah, points well taken. I certainly think that this book is can be read in one way, right? At least, right, as a kind of warning, a sort of warning about the perils of abstract thinking and scientific breakthroughs and so on.
Yeah, that's one of the strongest themes for me. All right,
All
well,
right.
let's leave it there. This was a great conversation, and we'll continue next time with part 3 of When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamín Labatut. And section 3 is called The Heart of the Heart, right?
That's right. And I think I must have perhaps maligned and mispronounced the protagonist's name, Grothendieck. How did you pronounce that?
Grothendieck.
Grothendieck. Is that's perhaps,
Mm-mm.
yeah, a fascinating portrait. So I'll look forward to diving into that next time.
All right. Well, we'll pick it up there next time.
Excellent.
Bye-bye, everyone.